Coffee originated in 6 to 7 BC in Kaffa, Ethiopia, and spread all over Europe through the Crusades. Coffee became known globally when European countries grew coffee beans in Asian colonies, like India and Indonesia. With a history of almost 1,400 years, coffee is loved for its various stories and constant evolution. It is black as hell, strong as death, sweet as love, like the old Turkish saying. Coffee has different tastes, scents, and appeal, depending on the country, ethnicity, climate, and environment. Let's lose ourselves in the world of coffee and its various charms with Shawn Steiman, the coffee scientist and creator of the Coffee Taster Training Program.
Today we're joined on G Lounge by coffee expert Dr. Shawn Steiman, who is visiting Seoul right now. And while enjoying the aroma and taste of coffee, we'll have a chance to learn a little bit about the secrets of this remarkable beverage. So welcome, Shawn. Tell us what brings you to Seoul this time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I am here in Seoul doing a little vacation, doing a little work. I'm working on some coffee school programs with my colleagues here, and just enjoying the place.
And how have you found the coffee culture here in Seoul?
The coffee culture is incredible here. It's so dizzying and surprising about how developed it is and how prominent it is. It's everywhere.
So tell us a little bit about your experiences here in Seoul. I believe you visited Seoul previously?
Yeah, this is my 4th trip, I think.
And what brought you here before and what brought you back?
It's all about coffee.
All about coffee. So tell us a little bit more specifically.
So professionally, my work is all in coffee, and I had the opportunity to work with some Koreans back in Hawaii some years ago. Mm-hmm. And we had a really great, week-long education experience. And one of them later wanted to open a school here. So he invited me out to say, hey, you want to work with me on this? I said, yes, I want to come to Korea and see where that goes.
Excellent. And so you've actually just developed what's called a Coffee Taster training program?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that program is?
Yes. And let me give you some context.
Please, please.
So in the coffee world, there's no overpowering organization that says, that bestows upon someone anything that says, you are an amazing taster and you're good at what you do. There's been various folks who have come up with their own things, but nothing universally accepted.
So like, for example, in the field of wine, there are the whole
sommeliers.
Hierarchy. Is there's not the equivalent of a sommelier for
No, there
coffee?
isn't.
Okay.
But there's various things similar.
All right.
Various programs that are trying to bestow upon people some skill set. And none of them are perfect, of course, because everyone has their own ideas.
Of course.
And it's very useful, I think, at this point in the coffee industry's evolution, to cater to a particular industry. So in Korea, for instance. Mm-hmm. So this program we've developed is about teaching people what it is to taste coffee and how to think about it. Right? You can just be an instrument and just taste and say, right, I'm good at this. But coffee is way more than that. Well, all food is more than that. And this is an opportunity to explore that with coffee. That's the idea.
Now, you have actually a doctorate in coffee science?
Technically, it's a doctorate in horticulture.
In horticulture,
but I really just studied coffee when I was doing it.
And what led up to your sort of study of coffee? What brought you to that level of expertise and what inspired you?
It was a hobby. It's always been a hobby. And when I was finishing undergraduate work and had to do something next, I discovered I really love school, and I had an opportunity to go study coffee in Hawaii for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. I thought, this is not a bad way to kill some time. And so I just got to play with my hobby.
So tell us a little bit the curriculum, the discipline of coffee science. What exactly makes up this field of study?
So what I did is that I organized it around horticulture, right? Growing coffee in the field and plants as a plant science. But you start to realize very quickly that's not just growing coffee. There's a whole field of chemistry, both on the plant side as well as the drinking side. There's plant physiology. There's plant ecology.
Right.
That's all just happens in production side.
Right.
Then you get to roasting. You get to sensory science, the consuming side. There's brewing science, which is sort of very specific chemistry.
Right.
There's sort of an endless amount. I mean, I have friends who are anthropologists, sociologists who study coffee, which is not where I went, but there's all
So
this
there's a
room.
whole range of possible fields of coffee.
Any field can touch it. That's sort of. I just stuck to the natural sciences part.
And how is that approach? How you learned about coffee? How does it differ, say, from how you teach about coffee now, or what the programs you've developed?
So when I was studying, it sort of invented my program. I had a very supportive advisor who was a coffee specialist himself in production, and he let me basically do what I wanted as long as I did what I was supposed to do. And it was all about reading and consuming and interacting with the coffee industry. Now that I'm past that and I do teach a lot about coffee, I confess I approach it from a very scientific perspective and how I see the world. So when I teach about coffee, it's all about explaining the whys and the hows, giving people the tools to understand it the way I understand it.
Right.
Versus just saying, this is what you need to know. That doesn't work for me.
Now, there is a significant difference between, say, coffee in terms of the mechanics of how you plant coffee, how you harvest coffee, and then sort of connoisseurship, right? The question of the essence of appreciating a fine coffee. How do you, I assume in a way you're interested in the connoisseurship of coffee, but are the fields different? Did you find a whole, where does connoisseurship fit into that?
In two places. In general, historically, connoisseurship is totally different from production and creation.
I would think so.
Particularly with coffee, which is produced in the tropics and it's often consumed in colder places, in the West particularly.
Right.
So there's historically been a separation. But at least in the United States, there's a very strong movement of connecting consumers with the production or the farms where their products come from, the farm-to-table movement or direct trade, something like that. So now there's been people who've tried to teach the farmers what it is that the consumer is interested in. It's an empowerment idea. If I'm a farmer, I'm just selling you something. I'm just selling you something.
Right.
I can't negotiate well. It's not about the taste. It's about the commodity.
Right.
But if I have some appreciation of my own product, I can then take that knowledge and engage with you on the quality of it and the price of it and all the things that make me more empowered and make you more delighted to get a high-end product.
So coffee has a long history. It has a culture. And I know that there are many compelling narratives about the history of how this marvelous drink has evolved. And can you tell us a little bit about the sort of historical origins and development of coffee and how it's related to our current civilization?
Yes. So coffee evolved in the Ethiopia-Sudanese area of the world. And we know that because the diversity of the genetic material is highest at that point.
Interesting.
And before coffee was drunk, it was probably the fruit was eaten. The fruit has caffeine. The seeds in the fruit were probably mashed together and mixed with fat and stuff to sort of use as an energy pellet or bar or something like that. Somehow, some crazy people managed to get the seed of a fruit out of all those layers and dried down and roasted and extracted with water. I mean, the process of going from coffee on the tree to coffee in your cup is extensive.
It's not obvious, right? I mean, if you went to a bean, it's not obvious you make coffee.
It's not like an apple where you just eat it, or a tea where you just add hot water. All this processing. And chocolate too, by the way, is also very complicated. But so at some point, somewhere in Ethiopia, some people came up with this, that this is a drink to have. And they discovered it, and it kept them awake, because caffeine is good. And clearly, this is something they wanted to enjoy. There's lots of myths and stories about how this all transpired. So drinking started there. It moved north in Africa, settled in Yemen, in that area of North Africa, Middle East for a while, and it was highly guarded because this was great stuff and made lots of money when you sold it to other people. Eventually it left, went to Europe, where Europe then said, this is great, too great, we shouldn't be buying it from them, we should have it ourselves. And so they sent it to all of their colonies around the world, Central, South America. Well, before that, it went to East Indies area. And just once it took place somewhere, once it took root, it stayed there. Now, coffee is grown anywhere it can be grown. Some 80-odd countries grow coffee. 50 plus of them sell it commercially.
And today you can grow coffee beans. You can't grow them anywhere. But can you tell us a little bit about what the specific conditions are, what we need for excellent coffee in terms of rain, sun, temperature, and other necessary ingredients?
So in the generalist sense, coffee is a tropical crop. It has to grow in wonderful temperatures as much that humans prefer. So anywhere from the equator up to about as far north as Hawaii and about as far south as, say, northern Australia.
Right.
So basically, if it freezes, it dies in a number of hours. So it can't freeze. You don't want extreme temperatures.
Right.
Aside from that, it needs a certain amount of food and water, like all plants do, and nothing particularly secret or special about that. So really, it's about the temperature. And if you can manage that, you can grow it inside anywhere, as long as you have the right temperature. Many cafes are right behind us. There's some coffee trees growing in some pots.
Right.
They won't be super productive, but they'll eventually produce fruit.
So maybe we'll go over the process a little bit more. Coffee goes through a series of processes: harvesting, and then collecting the beans, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about what goes on between planting the seed and it ending up here in your cup.
Okay, sure. So it's a coffee that we drink is a seed of a plant. So this seed, if you just take it from one tree and plant it, becomes another tree. So that tree grows, it produces flowers, it produces fruits.
Right.
And but we don't care about the fruits per se. But we use the fruits as a proxy for when the coffee is going to taste good. So the way we want to eat bananas and oranges when they're ripe, we want to pick the coffee when it's ripe.
Right.
So we pick it when it's ripe. And so you have this fruit layer, and then several other layers, and then somewhere deep in the middle is a seed. And once you harvest it, you have to get all those layers off, and you have to dry the seed down. And there's lots of different ways you can do that.
This is before you roast it. You have to dry
well before you roast it, yeah. In fact, you have to dry it down so you can roast it.
Right. What would happen if you roasted it without drying it properly?
It would probably cook like a bean. Because there's so much water in there, the steam in the water.
Right.
I've never tried that, but I think next season I'm going to have to do that. Curious. I've never tried it. It's a great idea. So you have to get all these layers off, and you have to dry it down. There's lots of ways you can do that. Each one has its pros and cons. They all can influence the flavor in their own way. Once you get it dried down, all the layers off, then it's ready for roasting. And at that point, it's this very hard, green seed that if you bit into, it could break your teeth if you bite too hard. Then you roast it. And the roasting is a very transformative process, very complex chemically, absolutely necessary, can be quite complicated in theory. In practice, it can be quite simple, right? Just add heat. You can make it more complicated if you want. And then once it's roasted, then we can think about drinking it. From there, it's just a basic chemical extraction, right? You grind it up into bits. You don't even have to grind it up, right? You just have to use water, or it could be anything else, I suppose. Use some solvent like water and mix it with the coffee and get the flavors out.
But there's a whole range of these sort of like Dutch coffee and these different types of drips. And I mean, there are
tons of toys.
Science, right?
There's science and there's romance.
Right.
I can distill down the process in a scientific perspective, right? This is chemistry, right? It's water pulling out stuff from a matrix, right? That I could talk about that all day. Right. But there's so many ways you can do that. So in the practical world, we have lots of different pots and we have lots of different brew methods, and they all do their own thing. And that's part of the fun and the romance, right? Some days you want it made this way, and some days you want it made this way. You can do that because we're a clever society.
Excellent. So maybe I can ask a little bit about this term, coffee taster. So has this evolved to actually be an occupation, a profession in itself? And what are the differences, the nuances? I guess there are terms like coffee taster, Q grader, coffee roaster, barista, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about this field.
All right. There's a lot of stuff to talk about now.
Yes.
There's a lot of good things there. So historically, you have people growing coffee. You have all these people getting it to where it needs to be roasted. You have someone who does the roasting. So that's a profession. In a cafe setting, you have someone who makes the coffee. That's a barista.
Right.
And those occupations are what most people have always done with coffee. Now, when coffee became a big business, and there's somebody in a consuming country who had to buy coffee, wanted to buy it based on price and taste, they had to, taste all these coffees as samples before they purchased.
Right.
Because it makes, you and I spend $3 on a cup of coffee, $5, whatever. when
Seoul,
you're
it could
buying
be 5 more.
Right, I've noticed. I've noticed, but when you buy a container load of coffee, 40,000 pounds, right, 18,000 kilos or whatever, even at $1 or $2 a pound, that's a lot of money. So you have to be very particular about what you're spending your money on. So
Absolutely.
Occupations develop to taste that coffee as a yay or nay, or as a quality control measure.
Right.
And we've had those around for a long time.
You mean in terms of purchasing, to make sure this is what you
It's
what
mostly
you
in
want?
terms of purchasing.
Right.
There are also people who, on the QC, the quality control side, right? Now that it's been roasted in my company, I need to make sure it tastes right, or that the blend is right.
Right.
So we've had people who do tasting, and they've done it with their own purpose and their own vision in mind, which is fine. It's your business. You do what you need to do. Coffee now has become more global. It's become more connected between the producer, the person creating the product, a roaster or a cafe, and the consumer. And the experiences we've wanted have expanded. Right. There's more taste that we want. There's more ideas we want. There's more learning we want to do. And ultimately, people come to coffee for really 2 reasons: caffeine and taste. Some people it's just caffeine. Some people it's taste, and often it's both. Often it's both. But once you start really approaching it from a taste perspective, you need a way to talk about it.
Right.
So that we both can talk about it in an intelligent, almost somewhat objective way. So objective as possible, in my opinion. Right? Here we have this coffee in front of us. I might think it's the best coffee in the world. And I could say that to you. I said, this is great. But you don't know what I like, so that doesn't have much meaning for you, that I like this. What a coffee taster needs to do is say, not that I like this, but this is what this tastes like. Now, I can describe that to you well enough.
What would be some of the words you would use if you were going to describe it in a technical sense?
Well, if I were going to describe it to most people, I actually would try to be as untechnical as possible. Just because what good does it do for me to use lots of complicated terms and ideas? But important things, acidity. How much sparkle is there in this?
Sparkle.
In a positive sense, right? An orange we think is a good acidity. A lemon is not, because it's too much. Same with vinegar. We wouldn't really want vinegar acid in our coffee, but there's a measure of this brightness or sparkle that we might want in our coffee, or not want. So if I can tell you how much is there, that's very valuable.
Right.
How thick is it? Is it really heavy and syrupy-like, or is it thin and dainty?
Right.
So I can describe it in very skeleton-like terms, or any coffee we can talk about in these terms, important characteristics. But people who are really fanatical, they want coffee that tastes like coffee, but kind of tastes like something else, right?
Interesting.
Am I getting blueberries or caramel or flowers, right? The complexity, the nuance. The same way we talk about other high-end specialty products like wine or chocolate.
And tell us a little bit for the beginner, if you wanted to start and understand the aromas, the flavor of coffee, where did you begin if you want to sort of upgrade your sensibility?
I would think about a few basic ideas. So there's the smell, right? You have to smell it and recognize that there's smell there and that it's hopefully pleasing to you. And if it's not pleasing, so the great place to start is like or don't like. The place to move next is why do you like or not like? Can you put that into words? That's the most important transition, is to move away from a subjective experience, to explore deeper. And then to explore that, just taste and smell everything you can possibly can. Open jars of spices, taste different foods. Create a database or a lexicon of experiences that you can then discover somewhere else.
And then one sort of slightly elusive quality would be excellence. Like, is there one form of excellence, or are there multiple forms of excellence? When you talk about excellence in coffee, or sort of gourmet, extraordinary coffee, what do you posit?
I've written a lot about this topic because it's extremely complicated in my head. The reason I say that, and it's going to be a longer answer than you want, I think, it starts with this idea of liking versus not liking, and an objective versus subjective experience. We can definitely describe a huge range of coffee experiences, right? Instant coffee, or stale store coffee, or stuff that's supposedly the best in the world, that's been freshly roasted and pampered all its existence. They totally taste different.
Right.
And more people. So then you have these experts like myself who get this experience of wanting this arcane, esoteric experience of coffee that tastes like so much more than coffee. It's great, it's coffee, but it's more complicated. And a lot of people don't want that. So when we talk about coffee excellence, experts have a vision of what that means in their head.
Right.
Whereas other consumers have a very different vision.
Right.
And they're both right, because excellence is a subjective opinion.
There are some concrete, I mean, for example, there's Jamaican Blue Mountain, Hawaiian Kona, and Yemen Mocha, that are sort of chosen or determined to be three great coffees. What makes them stand out? What's behind that sort of assertion?
There are coffees that are expensive and storied and famous. That doesn't necessarily correlate with how they taste.
Right.
They might, but not necessarily.
Right.
And I say that, so I work in the Hawaii coffee industry. I've been there for about 15 years. I know it very well. I've had a lot of coffee from Hawaii. And much as you would expect, right? Some farmers are really good at what they do, and they produce a really great coffee, and some aren't so good at what they do. So, for one thing, to say that this place, Hawaii or Jamaica, produces great coffee is true, but it's also false. But to say they're better than other places because of their taste is, I think, very dangerous, and I don't agree with it at all. Because I just don't think it's true. But they are more expensive, and they are mythical in a way. And part of it's the marketing, the history, and the stories behind them, which do add value, and the value is there.
So let's talk about Korea, Seoul. Now, Korea has an enormous number of coffee drinkers, very enthusiastic, consuming an average of 300 tons of coffee a day, and is the second largest consumer of coffee in Asia. As a specialist who's worked on coffee for many years, what are your thoughts about Korea as an emerging coffee market, culture, and what you have seen here?
It's dazzling.
Dazzling.
Yesterday I was around town and I stood on a street corner and looked around, and I could see from that vantage point at least 5 different coffee shops within like half a block.
Right.
That's astounding. So there's so much desire.
Right. Have you seen any particular sort of trends in terms of what kind of coffee Koreans like, or how they like to consume coffee?
Not a specific trend, because I've seen 3 major pathways, if you will, 3 different market segments. Right. There's the instant coffee segment, which seems to be pretty strong.
Right.
There's the ready to drink, the canned coffee segment, which you find in stores all over the place. And then there's a specialty coffee segment where people are really seeking out both an experience.
That's growing very rapidly.
Very rapidly. I mean, when I say I could stand on a street corner and see 5 places, they're all specialty-like places. It's amazing. People want that either that taste experience and or they want that social experience of being out somewhere that's relaxed and interesting. And I mean, $5 for a cup is a lot, but it's not going to break your wallet.
So you can go in your coffee shop, you find espresso machines or hand-dripped, different sort of, or I guess this Dutch coffee extraction system. Tell us a little bit about the differences between these approaches to getting the coffee out of the bean.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, coffee is a fairly simple chemical extraction of beans, right? Of the beans. And we can do that with we can tweak various parameters, right? So with espresso, when we think of tweaking parameter, we think of adding high pressured water to extract it. Right. With the Dutch method, it's a very slow method that you use with cool or room temperature water. Right. With hand drip, it's sort of this hybrid of normal. Everyone thinks of it as just regular old drip coffee, at least in the West, where you just pour hot water over coffee grounds, at the bottom of it comes out your cup of coffee. Right. They're all just variations on this theme, and they all do something a little bit different. Right. You can also just put coffee and water together in a container, let it sit for a few minutes, and then strain it. Right.
Do you have a preference?
I really love full immersion, where the coffee and water sit together. Most famous is to be done in a press pot or French press. Right. But a really great espresso can be mind altering. I don't tend to prefer my coffee cold or room temperature. I tend to like it hot, so Dutch method isn't my favorite, or iced coffee isn't my favorite. But there's this great method called a vacuum pot, which is fairly old. It became very popular in the 40s and 50s, at least in the US, and it's a very visually stunning apparatus, and it looks very pretty and very chemistry lab-like, and I think it makes a really lovely cup of coffee. And I'm sucked into its romance, which is probably why it's one of my favorites.
So drawing back a little bit to the industry as a whole, now the coffee industry itself has grown considerably. It's a lot bigger than most of us imagine it to be. Tell us a little bit about it in terms of its scale and how it's become more sophisticated and more complex as an industry.
All right. So to help you set the stage,
Please.
there's this great idea that is often said, which is that coffee is the second most traded commodity behind petroleum. And it's totally not true, and it has probably never been true in its entirety, because while there's a lot of coffee produced and traded around the world.
Well, it was true in the 16th century, probably. I mean, there was no petroleum, so.
That's certainly possible. But there were spices and there was salt and there's other things it could have been. Could have been wheat, who knows? But that line, people like to say it because it makes us feel great about the industry, but the point is that coffee is incredibly important.
Right.
So in the last couple of years, world coffee production is something like about 10 million tons of unroasted coffee produced all over the world.
Sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. Maybe not even enough for the world's desires. It is the backbone of many economies, particularly in Africa, a lot in Central and South America. It's a good chunk of their exchange, their foreign exchange. And it's not just growing, right? So there's whole economies based on production, but we're sitting here in a cafe right now. There's whole economies based on roasting and selling it to consumers. It's in every part of our lives, and most of it is as a beverage of some kind. But there's a small point where there's caffeine is extracted from coffee sometimes and used. So there's a sort of side industries, but largely it's this enormous industry covering the entire world. It's enjoying it more and more, and it's almost all about drinking it.
Now, we may have some viewers out there who are thinking to themselves they'd like to get into the coffee industry themselves. They're seeing what a happy life you have, Shawn. Can you give some sense about what of the hot careers in terms of and emerging careers in terms of the coffee industry and what's out there, what's possible?
Yes, I'd be happy to. For most people, I'm going to stick to the consuming side of the world,
please,
because it's a little bit easier. The easiest way to start or delve is to be a barista. Learn to make a decent cup of coffee and do it professionally. It's the role of barista is not necessarily as respected as those of us in the coffee industry want it to be. They don't tend to get paid very much, but they're the face of the industry to most consumers. So it's a very certainly an emotionally valuable role.
And you'll live a happier life if you know how to make a good cup of coffee.
That's right. Except when you go back home or you go to a dinner party and everyone says, "Oh, this is what you have to do for us today is make us coffee." I think that's where most people start because it's easy to get into and there's a lot of opportunities. From there, people tend to want to roast coffee, because there's a lot of magic that happens and some craft and some skill. And there's a more difficult learning curve. So it's for people who like to learn, like to challenge, roasting becomes a really interesting launching point. But it's also the conversion point. As I said, without roasting, we don't get to drink coffee. So there's its position along the chain of command is very powerful. So those two things are easily accessible. From there, to become a coffee buyer or trader, there are fewer occupations there, but for people who like to take risks and who like to explore, they're spectacular positions to be in. And of course, I've met a lot of people who have decided living their lives in the West were great and wonderful, or maybe they've retired or they want to shift, they want to be farmers, they give that up and they go to somewhere that grows coffee and actually become coffee farmers. It's doable.
So you mentioned a little bit about some of the issues, the problems with coffee. You mentioned about fair trade, and there have been a lot of concerns raised recently about the impact on the environment, labor issues, and exploitation. Do you have any suggestions in terms of what we need to do, what we need to be aware of when we're drinking coffee and consuming coffee?
So coffee is, like I said before, often consumed in countries that have no notion or association with where it's produced. It's often produced by people who are very poor, who are not privileged the way we are in many ways, don't have access to resources or infrastructure or education. which is very convenient for us consumers because it keeps the price down of these products that we want. And it's not just coffee. It could be anything from clothes to electronics to chocolate, whatever. There's many, many people who produce coffee for us. And while just because you buy cheap coffee doesn't mean it was produced by someone or produced in an environmentally harmful way, there are people who want to ensure that that wasn't the case. So as you mentioned, there's various programs like Fair Trade or organic certification or shade grown.
What was the third?
Shade grown.
Shade grown. Yes.
There's a lot of social environmental programs.
Right.
Third parties who are standing between the consumer and the producer and say, we want to support this social or environmental ideal.
Right.
So we're going to inspect the farm and help them and say, and help them establish a situation that we think is appropriate. And then we're going to put a stamp on their coffee and say, this happened in the way we think it should happen. And as a consumer, then you can, if you're interested in those ideals, you can purchase and approach that coffee and be like, oh, I want it to be grown this way or by these sorts of people, so I'm going to look for that stamp.
Right.
A lot of this exists. But ultimately, while these things are very good in the sense that it helps bridge the gap,
right.
There's lots of farms that aren't bridged, but also it doesn't solve the problem of we want our coffee to be very, very cheap and not have to spend much money on it.
Right.
And so we don't want to necessarily, so by not wanting to give the producers very much money, we are disincentivized to pay more for our coffee.
Right.
What we really need to do as a society is decide, should we be paying more for our coffee? The reason I love being in the Hawaii coffee industry is because the farmers in Hawaii live like Americans live. Right? They live in houses and they have TVs and they have phones and they get to go on vacations, and that's delightful. But in order to support that lifestyle, we pay a lot for their coffee.
Right.
Whereas that small farm in Guatemala, he's not going on vacation because he probably doesn't even have electricity in his house.
Right, right. So, a slightly different topic. In terms of the different regions, say Europe, the United States, the Americas, Asia, are there some particular sort of general features you can say about the coffee cultures in these parts of the world? Or say the Middle East as well.
The Middle East, it's great to start with Ethiopia and the Middle East.
Right.
Ethiopia in particular, because since they're the originators of coffee, they have a very fine-tuned ritual about consuming their coffee in a very social and daily manner. It's really quite delightful. In the Middle East, so before people spent centuries developing brew methods for coffee, they brewed coffee a certain way, and they still sort of do it that way in a very simple way with some spices usually and some sugar. It's their method, if you will.
Right.
And it doesn't vary much around the Middle East, as far as I understand. Once you leave and go to Central and South America, Central and South America hardly drinks coffee internally at all. Brazil is changed this. They actually are on the way to becoming the world's greatest consuming country. They're going to surpass the U.S. soon, which is great because it means they're going to consume a lot of coffee, which means demand will go up and supply will go down and prices will go up. Europe and the United States, I feel, are in some way similar. Some of those, so Europe tends to be more espresso-based. U.S. tends to be more drip-based. But at the end, things are meshing and growing so much that the lines are blurring, I think.
So in any, say, large city, you can find different sort of varieties of coffee.
Certainly in any metropolitan city on the planet, you're going to find a huge variety of things, much like you will in Seoul. You have a huge range of things.
So as you get a more sophisticated audience, should I say, consumers for coffee, how is that sort of impacting the trends in terms of what's possible to do with coffee?
So we tend to associate sophistication with high-end specialty coffee. Fewer defects, more nuance and complexity. Right. What that is meaning is that as more people become sophisticated and search for these things, then you have more farmers who are hopefully producing it, earning more money for it because these things cost more. And so there is this, raising of the sea, lifting the boats to help everybody.
Right.
It doesn't mean that there's not as much of the coffee that other people want to consume. There's always going to be lesser, distinct flavored coffees. From my perspective, less good coffees. There'll always be that around. There'll always be people who just are going to grow something to be made cheaply and supply caffeine. But as the world wants more interesting stuff will be produced in different places. So different places will start producing it, which is great. Places that are already producing it will grow. And the only challenge we have to deal with is really climate change and how that's going to interact with what kind of coffee we can produce and where.
And then finally, in terms of coffee, there's aroma, there are all sorts of taste, but the caffeine seems to be a particularly potent part of coffee. And there is still some controversy about caffeine and its impact. People who have some skepticism or suggestions in terms of health about the consumption of coffee. What is the state of the art in terms of the medical sort of assessment of coffee, its implications for health, and what do you think are is it a good thing to do? Should you have a cup of coffee every day to live a long life? What are the impacts of caffeine in coffee?
So there's actually there's a conversation about caffeine and there's a conversation about everything else in coffee. And the reason there's a conversation about caffeine is because we've known about it for so long. And the response we had to caffeine is so obvious. Right. In the sense that it keeps us awake and gives us energy, seemingly. Right. And the scare of caffeine really happened as an advertising campaign against caffeine, which is why we learned. And then there's a slew of bad research in the past about coffee and caffeine. The state where it is now, though, caffeine seems to be sort of a really great drug in the sense that it's very ephemeral. Right? It has a life in your body, but once it's gone, it's gone. There is some addictive quality to it. Those people who drink a lot of it tend to get headaches when they don't get it. But it doesn't last forever, and they're difficult, but they're not horrendous. Right. Caffeine only seems to be bad in very specific cases, right? Very rare cases where you're allergic or you have some precondition that interacts with the caffeine or you drink it too late and it keeps you awake. Right. Large quantities where you'll might be shaky or get anxious. Things that could be moderated easily in a sense. So caffeine does not seem to be largely problematic with most people. As for the rest of the cup, the last 10, 15 years have shown a great deal of research suggesting coffee is really good for us and it can be very preventative of a handful of unpleasant complications and diseases. Usually, the more you drink, the better off you are, which is
good to hear.
Really good to hear, yeah. But all of these studies are also, very large epidemiological studies where you have, 20,000 people which have been surveyed over the course of, maybe decades in a sort of a self-reporting. They're big picture, teasing out data from this information, which is valuable, but it's not true cause and effect research. So we can't say that if you drink this much coffee, because we said to these 10,000 people, only drink 4 cups a day for the next 20 years. We just can't do that. Yeah. So we have these other looking back studies, and they're not as conclusive. They're highly suggestive, but not conclusive. But so there's lots of this data that says for all kinds of things, coffee's good to drink.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll come back to the most personal part in terms of what coffee means for you. Now you've stuck with it for a long time. You've made a whole career. What is it? What is the quality about coffee in itself that has had such an appeal for you personally?
I learned to love the taste of coffee when I was pretty young, and I could drink it when I was young. I think that helped a lot. And my mother, who I loved growing up, drank it, and that, I think, influenced my perception of it. Mm-hmm. Once I got that initial hold, clearly it's evolved since then. And for me, what I really love about coffee is that it's something that a good cup of coffee really makes me want to think about the coffee. It makes me want to think about the experience. Right? Sort of have this emotional, intellectual moment of this beverage, this thing that I don't have to have, that it, at best, keeps me awake and provides me with fluid. But it can do so much more for me in all kinds of ways. Right. And it's not that I can't get that from scotch or whiskey that I love or chocolate, which I love, because you can have those same experiences. Right. But coffee I have so much now, this history with, and knowledge base with, that it's intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, it's a huge part of me.
Very true.
And that I really love. And it's the path I've taken, so it's intertwined. I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
Well, it does. It certainly resonates for me. I mean, I can think through my life. You could sort of make a history of one's life in terms of those moments, sitting down and having a cup of coffee at this particular. Because you remember that moment of having that cup of coffee, whether it was when you were 15 or 20 or 30. So coffee or today, right? Sitting here and having this cup of coffee with you here, Shawn. So coffee has this sort of both cultural, chemical, psychological qualities. It seems to be a very interesting mix thereof.
It does, and it's very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's easy to find and easy to get, and it's legal and
that's nice.
It's
legal.
nice. It's nice, right? And I can share it easily with lots of people.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about coffee today, and look forward to having another cup of you in the near future.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.